Let's start with Silent Hill 2 Remake. I've got to say, it totally nails that eerie, unsettling vibe that made the original such a classic. I mean, Silent Hill 2 is already one of the most iconic horror games out there, but this remake, it's like they took all the stuff that creeped us out back in the day and cranked it up with these incredible graphics and sound design. The foggy town of Silent Hill looks absolutely gorgeous in this remake. Well, in a terrifying, twisted way, of course. The way the fog moves, the way the shadows creep along the streets, it's so atmospheric. Walking through those empty, run-down streets, you can just feel the tension building. I caught myself hesitating before turning corners, just bracing for whatever nightmare was waiting around the bend. The monsters are just insane. Pyramid Head is back, and just as horrifying as ever. Seeing him in high definition? Yeah, it gave me chills. And the sound design makes it even worse. In the best way. You'll hear these distant, unsettling noises, and it just puts you on edge the entire time. The sound of the radio static kicking in right before a monster appears still gets me every time. What I also love is how faithful the remake is to the original, but it also adds some nice quality of life improvements. The controls feel smoother. The combat is a little more refined, but it still keeps that you're not some action hero vibe. Every encounter with a monster feels dangerous, like you're barely scraping by, which is exactly what you want in a horror game like this. If you're into survival horror at all, or if you loved the original, you've got to check this out. Next we have Watch Dogs. You remember Watch Dogs? The first one? I feel like it doesn't get enough love. It's funny because when it first came out, everyone was hyped about the whole hacking thing. Yeah, it didn't fully live up to the insane expectations, but looking back, it was actually a pretty solid game. What really pulled me in was the whole idea of controlling the city with your phone. Like, you could hack traffic lights, cameras, basically turning the entire city of Chicago into your personal playground. There's just something so satisfying about sneaking into an enemy base and never even having to fire a shot. Just using cameras and distractions to mess with people. It made me feel like this tech-savvy mastermind. Aiden Pierce is a little brooding, and not the most charismatic character out there. But I kind of liked that about him. He felt like this guy driven by grief, and everything he did had this personal weight to it. I also loved how the city of Chicago itself felt alive. It's not just a backdrop, it reacts to what you're doing. If you cause too much chaos, people call the cops. And then you've got this whole cat-and-mouse chase through the streets, dodging police cars and helicopters. I had so many moments where I barely escaped by hacking a drawbridge or raising blockers just in time. The adrenaline rush from those moments was legit. I think it's one of those games that's way better than people remember. It had a fresh take on open-world action, with the whole hacking twist that really made it stand out. If you haven't played it in a while, I'd say give it another shot. It's got this cool, techie, modern, vigilante vibe. Next we have Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. This game is just pure fun. I thought Insomniac nailed it with the first game, but playing as Miles? It's like they cranked up the cool factor. From the moment you start swinging through the city, you feel that difference in Miles' style compared to Peter. He'd got that younger, more energetic vibe, and the way he moves those little spins and tricks mid-swing just makes it so satisfying to swing around New York. The story got so much heart. You can really feel the weight on Miles' shoulders, trying to live up to Peter's legacy, while figuring out what kind of Spider-Man he wants to be. He's got this personal connection to Harlem, too, and that adds a really nice, grounded layer to everything. It's not just about saving the city. It's about protecting his community, his friends, his family. I felt way more connected to his journey because of that. Plus, the combat is so slick. Those venom powers, absolute game changers. It never got old to just zap a group of enemies with a venom punch and watch them go flying, and combining that with his stealth abilities made for some really fun, creative fights. I'd go from sneaking around, taking out enemies one by one, to just leaping into the fray and unleashing chaos with his electricity. The combat just flows so well, and it's super satisfying to pull off those combos. Even though it's a shorter game compared to the first one, I honestly didn't mind. It felt like the perfect length for Miles' story, and I loved every second of it. And the ending, without spoiling anything, it just left me feeling hyped for what's next. Next we have Aliens Fireteam Elite. If you're a fan of the Aliens franchise, or even just into fast-paced multiplayer shooters, this game is such a ride. Cold Iron Studios really captured the whole being stuck in a xenomorph nightmare feeling. The second that motion tracker starts beeping with those little blips getting closer, it's like an instant panic button. It really nails that aliens tension, but in a fun, adrenaline-packed way. The multiplayer is honestly where this game shines. Whether you're rolling with friends or hopping in with randoms, the teamwork is key. And when the xenomorphs come flooding in from every angle, walls, ceilings, vents, it's pure chaos. But in a good way. Every firefight is intense, and it feels so satisfying when you survive a wave with your team by your side. I had a blast trying out the different classes. At first, I was all about the gunner, just laying down fire. But once I switched to the technician and started dropping turrets, it was game-changing. Each class has its own strengths, and when everyone's working together, it's like this perfect mix of strategy and mayhem. The levels are awesome too. You're moving through these dark industrial corridors, alien hives, and abandoned stations. It feels just like stepping into the aliens' universe. And while the xenomorphs are the main threat, they throw in some surprises, like synthetic enemies, which keeps things interesting and adds some variety to the combat. The progression system kept me hooked too. You're constantly unlocking new weapons, abilities, and gear, and it gives you that just one more mission itch. Next we have Final Fantasy XVI. I wasn't sure what to expect going in because the series has gone through so many different styles, but this one really grabbed me right away. First off, the story got this darker, more mature vibe compared to some of the other Final Fantasy games. I love how it dives deep into political drama, with all these nations fighting over the power of the Icons. It feels like you're watching this epic medieval fantasy unfold. And speaking of Iconso, man, those battles are insane. You've got these massive cinematic showdowns between these godlike creatures. The scale of it all is just jaw-dropping. Plus, the real-time combat system. It's smooth, it's fast, and it's so satisfying when you pull off these combos and juggle enemies midair. I think that shift away from the turn-based combat really helps the game feel fresh, you know? Now, the world of Valisthea is stunning. Everywhere you go, the landscapes just pull you in. From vast deserts to lush forests, it's one of those worlds that begs to be explored. I found myself constantly stopping to just take in the view. The towns and cities feel lived into each. One has its own vibe, and I loved talking to NPCs and learning more about the world's lore. Plus, the side quests, they actually have depth. It's not just go fetch this or kill that, but instead, they give you more context about the world and characters, which I always appreciate. I think the only thing that threw me off at first was how different it feels from classic Final Fantasy games. But honestly, it's a good thing. It's like the series is evolving, trying new things. Next we have Bramble the Mountain King. It's one of those games that totally caught me by surprise. I went in thinking it was just going to be this cute little fairy tale adventure. It's got this dark, eerie vibe running through it. Almost like a grim fairy tale brought to life. The story follows this little boy, Ola, who's on this journey to save his sister. And let me tell you, it gets intense. What really stood out to me was the atmosphere. The world feels like you've stepped into this creepy, enchanted forest, with all these Nordic myth-inspired creatures and environments. Some parts are absolutely stunning, with beautiful, serene landscapes, and then suddenly you're thrown into something terrifying. The way the game balances those moments of calm and absolute terror is so well done. I found myself constantly on edge, never really sure what was lurking around the corner. The puzzles in the game are really fun too. They're not overly complicated, but they make you think just enough to feel satisfying when you solve them. And it fits the tone perfectly. You're this little kid in a big dangerous world trying to outsmart creatures way bigger than you. And I loved how it made me feel both vulnerable and clever at the same time. One thing that really hit me though is how Bramble isn't just about survival. It's also about exploring this magical yet dangerous world. Every area feels distinct, and you never know what you're going to run into. It's one of those games that stays with you, not just because of the scares, but because it feels like you've stepped into this strange, enchanted world that you don't want to leave even when it gets terrifying. Next we have Far Cry 4. It's one of those games that really sticks with you. Right from the start, you're thrown into this beautiful yet chaotic Himalayan country called Kyrat, and boom, there's Pagan Min, the villain you'll love to hate. He's charming in the most unsettling way, and I just couldn't get enough of his weird charisma. Honestly, he steals the show every time he's on screen. But beyond the story, what really drew me in was Kyrat itself. The world is just stunning. You've got these towering mountains, lush valleys, rivers, and temples scattered everywhere. I found myself getting lost in the world, not just doing missions, but just exploring, climbing cliffs, gliding off with a wingsuit, or hunting animals to upgrade my gear. It's one of those open-world games where every corner has something to discover, and it just makes the world feel alive. Now, the gameplay is so fun. You can tackle situations however you want, and for me, that meant switching between stealthy bow kills and, riding elephants into enemy outposts like a madman. Seriously, who doesn't love charging through a camp on an elephant? And the wildlife itself adds a whole other level of unpredictability. I've lost count of how many times I was sneaking up on an enemy, only for a tiger or bear to crash the party and wreak havoc. The missions are great too, especially the ones involving the Golden Path. You get to make decisions that affect the revolution you're part of, and they're not always black and white. I liked that it made you think about the consequences. All in all, Far Cry 4 is just packed with stuff to do. It's got this mix of intense action and moments of absolute chaos. Next we have Numata. I went in thinking it was going to be your typical first-person horror experience, but it's so much more than that. The game has this incredible way of messing with your mind, and I love how it plays with psychological horror. Not just cheap jump scares. Don't get me wrong, there are definitely moments that'll make you jump, but it's the slow burn that really sticks with you. One thing I really appreciated, you're kind of left to figure things out on your own, which adds to the immersion. The puzzles are clever without being frustrating, and they're tied into the story in such a cool way. You're not just solving random puzzles for the sake of it. They're woven into the narrative, and they make you feel like you're uncovering more about what's really going on. And the story? It's super mysterious and keeps you guessing. I love that it's not immediately clear what's happening. There's this deeper, almost philosophical layer to it that kept me hooked. You start piecing things together as you go, and the more you learn, the creepier it gets. I remember getting to certain parts and being like, wait, what is going on? But in a good way, where it pushes you to keep exploring. The game also plays around with reality a lot, and I think that's one of its strongest points. There were moments where I wasn't sure if what I was seeing was real or if it was just in the character's head. It messes with your perception, which is perfect for a horror game. It really feels like you're experiencing a psychological breakdown, and it's a ride from start to finish. It's one of those games that sticks with you after you finish playing, making you think about the story and what it all means. Next we have The Surge 2. I feel like it doesn't get enough credit, but I had such a good time with it. If you're into that whole Souls-like experience, but with a sci-fi twist, this game is exactly what you need. It takes that punishing, tactical combat formula and throws it into this futuristic, dystopian world, which is a super cool setting for this kind of gameplay. The thing that really hooked me was the combat. It's brutal, but in the best way. You're not just hacking and slashing mindlessly. You actually have to target specific limbs, which adds a whole new layer of strategy. I loved figuring out which part of an enemy I wanted to focus on. Do I go for the unarmored areas for an easy kill? Or do I try to chop off a limb to get some sweet gear? Every fight felt like a puzzle, and I never got tired of that. Jericho City has this gritty industrial feel to it. The world building is solid. There's this mix of high-tech and complete chaos, and as you explore, you find out more about what went wrong in this messed-up future. The city itself is pretty open, with tons of shortcuts and hidden paths, which made exploring feel rewarding. Plus, the verticality of the levels was cool. You're not just walking through corridors, you're jumping, climbing, and finding secret areas that connect back in smart ways. It had that same feeling as Dark Souls, in how the world loops back on itself. The story is pretty interesting too. You're kind of dropped into this mess without much context, and as you play, you slowly piece together what happened in Jericho City. Next we have Ghost Recon Wildlands. It's one of those games that kind of slipped under the radar for a lot of people, but honestly, it's so much fun once you get into it. I mean, the sheer scale of the open world is wild. Bolivia is your playground, and you can literally go anywhere. I remember the first time I jumped in a helicopter and just flew over this huge mountain range, seeing the sprawling landscape below. It's kind of breathtaking, even for an older game. The thing that really stands out, though, is how flexible the gameplay is. You've got this whole squad with you, and you can approach missions in so many different ways. If you're feeling tactical, you can scout out an area with your drone, mark enemies, and silently pick them off one by one. Or you can just go in guns blazing and let the chaos unfold. And I love that both options work. There's no one way to play it. And man, playing co-op with friends, that's where it gets really fun. There's nothing quite like coordinating an attack with your buddies, where everyone's got their role. One person's sniping, another's on the ground sneaking in, and then you're calling in air support. It just makes you feel like a real squad. Of course, it doesn't always go according to plan, and when everything falls apart, it turns into this hilarious mess of trying to escape or salvage the mission. But that's part of the charm, right? I also appreciate how the game doesn't take itself too seriously. Sure, it's got this gritty cartel storyline, but the characters crack jokes, and there are these moments of levity that break up the intensity. The only downside? I guess some missions can get a bit repetitive if you're playing solo for too long. But even then, the world is so big that if you get bored, you can just switch things up.